it's not the third leading cancer, ranks 5 now in cancer incidence. It's still the third leading cause of cancer-related deaths, and the 5-year survival in hepatocellular carcinoma is less than 5%. So it's a highly lethal cancer, and basically it's resistant to most conventional chemotherapy therapy. And it's been known for years to be associated with chronic liver inflammation, hepatitis, caused by either infection with hepatitis viruses, HBV or HCV, and in more recent years, the connection between obesity and different obese situations in the liver, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and hepatocellular carcinoma has become rather obvious. So we spent quite a lot of time studying some of the mechanisms that drive the development of these tumors in animals. Mice feed them with the carcinogen, skeleton nitrosamine, and I'd just like to summarize this study. I switch to talk about the role of obesity. So DN is actually a procarcinogen. It undergoes metabolic activation in zone 3 hepatocytes, and it leads to very high incidence of hepatocellular carcinoma, especially in male mice. And we tested whether the activation of NF-kappa B by the ITK beta is involved in the development of this tumor. And we thought that if we would block the activation of NF-kappa B in hepatocytes, we will have similar results to what we saw in colitis-associated cancer. And much to our surprise, when we knocked out ITK beta, we actually stimulated and accelerated tumor development, and the knockout mice exhibited a much higher degree of mortality, more tumors, larger tumors. We also accelerated tumor development. We asked what's common to ITK beta and P38 alpha, and we thought maybe they control a common pathway or a common set of target genes. And much to our surprise, we found little in common between those two kinases and the pathways that they activate, except that the knockout of either one leads to increased accumulation of reactive oxygen species. And we could relate this increased tumor development to increased ROS accumulation. And the most important thing that what we think that the reactive oxygen species are doing, other than having effect on some molecular target, is that they actually lead to cell death. And the liver represents a rather unique situation, because cell death in the liver actually triggers cell proliferation, and you can see this very well in the ITK beta knockout mice. And if you look at either control mice or the knockout mice, you look at basic rates of cell death in the liver. Looking at apoptosis with a tunnel assay, it's extremely low. You give DN, it undergoes metabolic activation in zone 3 hepatocytes, just around this region of the liver, and some of the cells, because they will accumulate reactive oxygen species, we believe, undergo cell death. And you can see that in the knockout animals, there's a lot more cell death, and despite the increase of cell death, you don't have less cancer, you actually have more cancer, because the more cell death there is, the more cell proliferation you find around the region where cell death occurs, and you can identify the proliferating cells by labeling them with bromodeoxyuridine. And when you merge the tunnel positive cells with the VRDU positive cells, you find that they're in close proximity to each other. And we believe that in the liver, cell death and cell damage drive cell proliferation, and that's critical for tumor development, because the main difference between the colon, in where NF-kappa B actually drives tumor development in epithelial cells, and the liver, where NF-kappa B in the epithelial cells actually inhibits tumor development, lies there in their respective tissue kinetics. And whereas the half-life of the average hepatocyte in the mouse is about 6 months, and most hepatocytes after 2 weeks of age in the mouse, slightly later age in the human, are synchronized in the G0 phase of the cell cycle, and parasites in the mucosa are actually replaced every 1 to 2 weeks. They don't live very long and they're repressed constantly, and damage to the mucosa doesn't really accelerate the rate of cell renewal because the cells are already replaced at the maximal rate, so it's not the bottleneck that determines the amount of cell proliferation in the tissue. But in the liver, a tissue that doesn't proliferate, if you stimulate cell proliferation, that has a major impact on tumor development. So to model all of these results, we have to consider the liver. This is actually a highly simplified representation of the liver. We are looking at only 2 cell types. The major cell type is the parenchymal cell, the hepatocytes. Interspersed between them are resident liver macrophages or Cooper cells. We introduce the carcinogen into the mice. In some cells, it leads to induction of oncogenic mutations, but if these cells don't proliferate, they will not transmit the mutant alleles to their progeny, and it doesn't matter how many RAS or MYC genes or whatever you will activate, you're not going to end up in cancer. But in quite a few other cells, exposure to DN leads to cell death through accumulation of reactive oxygen species, for instance. And we postulate that these dead cells somehow communicate with the living hepatocytes, and we know that the communication involves the activation of Cooper cells, which then produce interleukin-6, that stimulates the proliferation of the residual hepatocytes. And when you have this one wave of proliferation, now you amplify the number of initiated cells, and then additional events can occur. And that's where we don't really know what's going on anymore, and eventually tumors will develop, and if I have time at the very end, I may address this aspect. So another interesting and intriguing feature of hepatocellular carcinoma is that it exhibits a marked gender bias, and as I said initially, obesity increases liver cancer risk in men, but not so much in women, just because women don't develop a lot of hepatocellular carcinoma, so there was not too many cases to look at least in the US. And we have shown that part of these gender differences depend on differential production of IL-6, which again in the DN model is produced early on by activated Cooper cells, which are actually activated by components released by dying hepatocytes. And we know that one of these components is actually interleukin-1 alpha, which is stored in large amounts in normal hepatocytes, released upon cell death, activates a receptor that then transmits the signal via the NYD88 adapter protein, leading to activation of ITK beta and NF-kappa B, driving the transcription of IL-6, and then in females, where estrogen receptor alpha is activated, you get lower production of IL-6 because this is a repressor of the IL-6 gene, and lower production of IL-6 leads to less compensatory proliferation, and in this case, less cancer. So with this, I'd like now to switch to obesity. And we were interested in modeling the obesity in mice, and then using the mouse model to understand how obesity increases the risk of the hepatocellular carcinoma. So we have done two things. We have combined the administration of DN to 2-week-old mice with exposure to high-fat diet. What we do is we inject the mice with DN at 2 weeks of age, let them recover for about 2 weeks, and then at 1 month of age, we divide the group into two. Half are placed on high-fat diet, 60% of the calories come from fats, and the rest are maintained on normal chow or low-fat diet. And you